Today, we become legends.
SMITE is technically over 11 years old at this point, if you include the time spent in alpha and beta. Over that time, many core things have changed within the game, for better or worse. This video will cover some of these major paradigm shifts in SMITE's mechanics, so let's jump in. So first up is the removal of boots back in patch 8.7 in July 2021. There's been a lot of talk in the community lately about removing boots, with some people saying it's one of the best changes ever made, and others saying it has literally killed the early game power curve and messed up the flow of the game. Me, I think I sit mostly on the side of this being a great change. I can see the argument that power curves were probably smoother back then, since the difference between the 4 boots was pretty minimal compared to the difference between rushing Book of Thoth versus rushing Spear of Desolation, for example. But overall, I think the removal of boots did promote a lot more build diversity in the early game, which is worth it in my opinion, as well as allowing you to run a full 6-item build rather than one of your slots being taken up by boots. Of course, the Elixir of Speed was added before this removal, which was just an extremely clunky and expensive way to do the same thing, especially nowadays when we keep and upgrade our starter item. If boots were still a thing, that's 1/3 of your item slots eaten up before you even consider your normal items for the build. Starters are a bit different to boots because they have that built-in diversity already, with 15 total options that comprise 30 different full items compared to just 4 with boots. I will say that giving everyone free movement speed per level for the first 7 levels is a classic high-res move of not really knowing how to remedy the issue in a smart way, so you just kind of blunt force the problem and hope it worked. It's not bad necessarily, but it does feel a little bit bull in a china shop to me. Alright, so that was some fairly recent SMITE history with the boots removal. Let's go all the way back to SMITE's closed beta and talk about the physical magical split. So for those that don't know, SMITE used to work on a system where any god could build any item and use either type of power. Your ability damage type was dependent on your class, just like now, with mages and guardians having magical scaling on their abilities and assassins, warriors and hunters having physical. But the kicker was that no matter your god class, all basic attack damage was physical and scaled with physical power. This led to some hilarious ideas like auto attack crit Ymir stacking Deathbringer with his passive bonus, and just Freya with Deathbringer in general must have been terrifying back then. I can't find an exact date on when this was changed, and I didn't play in this time period either, so I'll take my opinion with a grain of salt, but I do think there's something worth exploring here in terms of certain gods being able to scale well with either power type. Even if it's just one god that specializes in doing that, I think it would be neat to have in the game. Should the entire game be reverted to work like this? Probably not, but I think it's an interesting idea to explore. Patch 9.5 is probably the most infamous and well-known single patch in SMITE history. Many items had their stats reduced across the board, as well as every god in the game gaining more base health and protections. This essentially boils down to all gods becoming 30% tankier at level 1, and then an extra 8% tankier per level up to level 20, when all gods essentially have about 60% more base health and protections than they did before 9.5. Of course, it's more complicated than that, since base stats are only one part of the puzzle and your build matters, but that is essentially what 9.5 aimed to do. Slow the game down, reduce burst damage, and create more tactical gameplay that is less focused around which dude hits their ability first that one-shots you. This entire idea is probably one of the single most controversial changes ever made to SMITE. It seems like no matter who you are or when you started playing, you have a strong opinion on whether this patch was godlike or garbage. It seemed to be relatively well received at launch, but over time does seem to have soured in the community's perception a little bit. I think the main reason for this is because a lot of what it tried to do just got reverted over time by various busts, to the point where the meta is just as bursty now as it was before 9.5. The changes didn't really make enough of an impact on changing that time to kill in the long term, but had a lot of individual downsides and unforeseen consequences of such a sweeping change to the game's core mechanics. Where do you stand on 9.5? Are you firmly of the belief that it was a necessary patch to slow down the power creep and burst meta of SMITE, or do you think it was an abomination that made the game more boring and slow? Let me know in the comments. Next up is the removal of Conquest side jungles, which is another pretty OG change. Again, this was before my time, so take whatever I say on this with a grain of salt, but I do kind of like the idea of having side jungles as a way to make laning fights more dynamic in the side lanes. Mid lane sort of already has this in a way, since it technically does have side jungles, if you can call them that, but I feel like these side jungles that used to exist back in beta would make the solo and duo lane a much more interesting place to fight. You can put buffs or XP camps or totem or whatever in these areas to make sure they don't go unused, and I feel it would improve the experience of boxing and fighting in these lanes. At the very least, I think solo lane should have a side jungle, if not duo as well, because a lot of bruiser fighting and boxing happens in that lane, and having an extra area on the side that's a little bit further from tower will be really interesting in my opinion. Hell, it will probably even help alleviate the mage solo meta we're in currently, as the mages would have to step up into the side jungle to contest these camps, giving warriors a chance to push them out with their early game advantage. Since at the moment, mages just insta-clear the wave and you really can't fight into that. We've had mini side jungles since the removal of these ones, and I think for the most part they were pretty successful in encouraging players to fight over the neutral farm rather than just clearing a wave, going to get your buff, clearing a wave, etc. I personally would like to see a return to major side jungles though, at least in solo, but what do you guys think? As far as I'm aware, this is also a pretty controversial one, with some people loving the idea of side jungles and others saying they completely ruin the laning experience. But finally, let's talk about bruiser items. I know this topic has been beaten like a dead horse recently, so I won't spend too long on it, but the removal of power from protection items had significant game-wide impacts. Mostly on the solo lane, but what happens in one lane will inevitably spill over into the other lanes and team fights. Without these hybrid bruiser items, warriors simply struggle to PvE and PvP at most stages of the game. Losing 15 or 20 power doesn't sound like a lot, but over the course of 50 ability rotations and 100 auto attacks throughout the laning phase, it really does start to add up. Especially on the auto attack side of things, since physical autos scale at 100% of power regardless of your class, so that 20 power we lost from Glad Shield adds up to 200 damage over the course of 10 autos on the wave or through boxing. This mostly impacted the laning phase, as we now see with the mage solo meta, where warriors simply can't compete with their pressure, wave clear and PvE potential, but this also had a profound impact on how solo laners play in team fights. It used to be that solo laners, warriors specifically, would leverage the efficiency of defense and have just enough damage to be a true threat to backliners. However, after these changes, it's never felt the same to teamfight as a solo. It always feels like you're just lacking any kind of real damage on the backline unless you literally go 2 or 3 dedicated damage items and become a glorified jungler. If that's the way Hi-Rez wants solo laners to feel, then fine, but I strongly believe that the game will be more fun for everyone when every role can have the impact that they want in a teamfight late game. And while I'm not trying to say that warriors have zero impact, I do think they're a far cry from the early years of Smite when you could actually dive and kill backliners effectively, and the onus was on the support and backliners to coordinate and deal with your dive. Nowadays, you can dive the mid, and even if the enemy ADC and support completely ignore you and just let it happen, you probably still lose that 1v1 to the mid anyway. That's not how it used to be. But anyway, I said I won't rant too long on bruiser items, so there you go. What are your guys' thoughts on the state of warriors right now? Let me know below. Catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.